We would like to remind our guests to kindly make sure to put their phone sets on silent mode or switch them off, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of His Excellency Professor Jamal Sanad al-Suwaidi, the Director General of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, we would like to welcome you this morning to a lecture titled US-China Relations and the Implications for Small States, to be delivered by Mr. Bilahari, Kausikan. Mr. Kausikan is currently chairman of the Middle East Institute, an autonomous institute of the National University of Singapore. From 2001 to 2013, Mr. Kausikan was the second permanent secretary and then permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore. He was subsequently ambassador at large until May 2018. Mr. Kausikan previously served in a variety of appointments in the ministry, including as the Deputy Secretary for Southeast Asia, the permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, and as ambassador to the Russian Federation. A regular commentator on international affairs and political developments, Mr. Kausikan was educated at Raffles Institution, the University of Singapore, and Columbia University in New York. The speaker will be discussing today the US and China having entered a new phase in their relationship, characterized by long-term strategic competition. War is improbable, although neither the US nor China are likely to achieve their goals in their entirety. Nevertheless, the new and challenging strategic environment is likely to persist, particularly for small states. Navigating the uncertainties will require the capacity for robust analysis, a clear understanding of national interests, and a political courage to pursue them with determination. And now it gives us great pleasure to welcome our speaker to deliver his lecture. Mr. Kausikan, the floor is yours, sir.
Go over there. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to address you this morning. I hope you will not conclude that it was an act of reckless folly on the part of the center. I don't have a formal lecture because I don't want to subject you to a monologue. Rather, I will make some introductory remarks on the topic at hand and hope to have a dialogue with you. I think that will be probably more interesting to you and also to me. So without further ado, let me go straight into the topic. As the moderator had mentioned, I think US-China relations have entered into a new long-term phase. From 1972, when the two countries re-established relations after the Communist Revolution, to circa, let us say, 2009, the global financial crisis, of course, there were competitive elements in the relationship, and of course, there were moments of tension, but the overall balance of the relationship was on engagement. I think that now has flipped. Engagement, of course, will not stop, and they will still cooperate when their interests coincide. But the overall balance of the relationship is now on long-term strategic competition. One of the tropes used to characterize the Trump administration is that under the Trump administration, America is in retreat. I really don't understand this, because the administration has made it clear in a number of official documents, for example, its national security strategy published in December 2017, that it is determined to compete robustly, not just with China, but with Russia. Now, you may debate this policy, you may have your own views about this policy, but a policy of robust strategic competition cannot be accurately characterized as a retreat. Now, I think it is important, having said that this new direction in US-China relationship is not just about Mr. Trump. China has actually achieved something near miraculous. It has united the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, because if there's one thing that they agree upon, it is on a tougher approach to China. I visit Washington regularly, a couple of times a year, and my conclusion is if there is a debate over China policy, it is over tactics, not the goals. And I think whoever replaces Mr. Trump, whether in 2020 or 2024, the difference will be one of degree, not of kind. Now, the focus of media
أن تركيز وسائل
attention in many countries, and rightly so, is on the so-called trade war. And I say so-called because trade is only the instrument. The objective is, as I have described it, strategic competition. I am not very hopeful that there will be a deal. I don't know. There may be. I hope there will be some kind of a deal, but I'm not very hopeful. And if there is a deal, I think my guess would be it will be limited in scope, and it will be temporary. Why? There is a basic fact about China that is so obvious that we often overlook it. China is a communist country, not in its ideology anymore, but in its political structure. It is a country led by a Leninist party, and a Leninist party is one that claims absolute control over every facet of state and society. And many of the complaints, whether it is on trade, intellectual property, stem from this basic fact, that it is a communist country, and therefore any entity, any Chinese entity which is connected to the party, and every Chinese entity has to be in one way or the other connected to the party, has a certain privileged position. And that's the essential, the root cause, shall we say, of some of the complaints of a lack of a level playing field and so on. And that is not something that is going to change. China has taken certain steps, has changed its investment law, has taken steps to improve its protection of intellectual property, but that particular fact that it is a Leninist state, if you prefer that term, is not going to change. That is one demand that the Chinese will never submit to. In other words, there will always be some degree of complaint about lack of a level playing field, because that's the nature of the beast. A lot of focus has been on the tariffs, and that is, of course, important. I mean, my own country has suffered quite a significant economic slowdown because of the trade war and the slowing growth in China. But I think the far more important part are the restrictions on technology transfer. New legislation has been put in place in the US, and that's a new framework for US-China relations that will persist irrespective of what happens to the trade war narrowly defined. And it's going to be a big problem. Now, I do not pretend to be any kind of expert on technology. I can barely use my iPhone. But those who know tell me, and it is intuitively something that I would agree with, that you cannot, insofar as America's intention is to decouple its economy and those of its friends and allies from that of China, it cannot succeed. It may succeed in certain specific areas, but not in entirety. Conversely, insofar as China's response is to build an alternative system, it too cannot succeed, at least not in entirety. And therein lies the complication for the rest of us. I'll come back to this. A trade war benefits no one. American consumers will be hurt, but at least in the short term, maybe the medium term, it has exposed some of China's serious vulnerabilities. Growth has slowed. I think it is very clear that China fundamentally misjudged the direction of American foreign policy. In my own estimation, sometime after the global financial crisis, China began to believe its own propaganda of its inevitable rise and America's inevitable absolute decline. Of course, there will be relative adjustments. I think China also overgeneralized from its experience of the Obama administration, who clearly, despite making very nice speeches, had no stomach for strategic competition, particularly in areas like the South China Sea. And they thought this was a new norm of American foreign policy, at least in East Asia. They were wrong. It was a serious misjudgment for which Mr. Xi, actually the misjudgment began in the latter part of Hu Jintao's administration, I think, but was certainly reinforced under Mr. Xi, and he has been subjected to some internal criticism for that. It has exposed certain gaps in Chinese technology, which I think they are going to find difficult to fill, at least in the short to medium term. It will cost them a lot, and it will take quite a long time. But most fundamentally, it has exacerbated the core issue that the Chinese are facing. And I have to give you a little bit of Chinese political history, so bear with me. I'll make it as brief as I can. At the 18th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in 2012, the party acknowledged that the growth model, a growth model basically based on a heavy reliance on investment in infrastructure led by state-owned industries, that growth model that had led to the spectacular growth of the 1990s and early 2000s was reaching the end of its use.
قد وصل إلى نهاية.
There will be a new normal of slower growth, and even to sustain slower growth, there would need to be a new model. And the subsequent year, in 2013, at the plenum of the Communist Party, they rolled out a plan, quite a detailed plan, that had its core, a more, and this is a quote, a more decisive role for the market in the allocation of resources. Now, very little of that plan has been implemented. Not nothing, but very little has been implemented, and policy has been pulled in contradictory directions. Why is this so? Let me come back to the point I made. China is a Leninist state. A Leninist party is one that demands absolute control over every facet of state and society. Now, control and market efficient and the market are diametrically opposed values. The market means, by definition, less control. It's not an absolute distinction, but what is the new balance between control and market efficiency? They did not know what their new balance is, and I don't blame them because nobody has ever tried it before. And they still do not know. 2 years ago, in 2017, a lot of the international commentary, whether official or media or academic, focus on China's global ambition that was evident at that Congress. Now, I don't think that's the most important thing about that Congress. And there's nothing unusual about a big country having big ambitions. In fact, it's normal for a big country to have big ambitions. What was more important about that Congress was President Xi Jinping's redefinition of the principal contradiction facing China. And he defined that contradiction as the contradiction between China's uneven and unbalanced growth and the Chinese people's ever-growing needs for a better life. In other words, rising expectations. And from that, there was a lengthy and complex agenda of about 15 or 16 items. It's all in the speech, depending how you count. At least 15, maybe 16 items, all domestic. Everything from promoting innovation, dealing with the aging population, better healthcare, better housing, better education, and many other things. Each of these items was complex in itself. Taken in totality, it is a daunting challenge. To deal with this challenge, you need immense resources and some time, quite a long time. How much resources, nobody can tell at this point. How much time, nobody can tell at this time. But it is beginning to dawn on China and other countries too, that while China's resources are vast, vast is not infinite, nor is it inexhaustible. And to deal with these problems over the long time needed to deal with it, you would need to continually replenish resources. And therein lies the central challenge. To replenish resources, you need to continue to grow. To continue to grow, you need a new growth model. The new growth model must be based on a new balance between control and economic efficiency. And what is that new balance? Nobody knows. If you look at it in this slide, the Belt and Road Initiative can be interpreted in this context. Because what is the Belt and Road Initiative? It is an ambitious slogan. A slogan is not, however, a strategy. It is a collection of projects.
استراتيجية وهو مجموعة من
Chinese growth model based on state-owned enterprise-led investment in infrastructure and planting it around the world in order perhaps to gain some growth, to buy some time to figure out what that new balance between control and efficiency should be. It is all becoming evident that the Belt and Road Initiative is not without its own liabilities, not just to recipient countries, but to China itself. I think some winnowing out of projects is almost inevitable. It's already begun. Some projects have been renegotiated, some have been cancelled, some have been scaled. In a project of such a vast scope, consisting of so many different parts. Some will work better than others. Some will stall and some will fail. There's nothing unusual about that. What all this amounts to is a far more complex international environment that small countries like my own and the UAE and many others, I think, will have to navigate. And since this is a long-term thing, you'll have to navigate it not just for a year or two or three, but I think for some decades. How do we navigate it? First of all, I think we should have no illusions. Both the United States and China tell us all repeatedly that they don't want us to choose. I don't believe them either. They clearly want us to choose. Right? Secondly, so we should have no illusions about what's the challenge. They do want us to choose no matter what. They may swear blind otherwise. Secondly, I think we have to understand that this is not a new situation in its essence. We often come to think of the American-led liberal international order as the natural order of things. It is not. In fact, that American-led liberal international order was unchallenged only for a historically short and exceptional period, only from maybe 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed to maybe circa 2009 when the global financial crisis broke out. Otherwise, for most of the latter part of the 20th century, the international order and the regional order was divided and contested. Divided between the Soviet Union and the United States and contested. And that is perhaps a more normal state of affairs in international relations than that brief and historically exceptional period when the American order was unchallenged and unquestioned, maybe. We are now returning to a more normal state of affairs. But it is not a new Cold War. That is a sloppy metaphor that the media is fond of using, but it's very sloppy, intellectually sloppy, I mean. The Cold War was essentially very simple in structure because the US and the Soviet Union interacted only on the margins. China and the US are both vital nodes in the world economy, and they are both deeply entangled in a way that is unprecedented among major powers, historically unprecedented. And that is the complication. As I said earlier, I do not think either can succeed insofar as that their goal, neatly separating themselves from each other. And that creates complications for the rest of us. How do we deal with this? I don't think it's rocket science. At least in Singapore, when I was in the ministry, I kept telling our new recruits that for a small country, you must start from the premise that you are irrelevant in the international system. No? And so your basic strategic challenge is to create relevance for yourself. Now, how you create relevance, of course, is going to change over time. But it has to start from a very clear sense of what your interests are. And what your interests are in the most fundamental sense, a very clear sense of who you are and who you want to be and who you want to remain. And from that, everything else follows. I don't think there's any magic formula in this new, more complex dynamic that is emerging between the US and China for us to navigate. We have to follow our interests. Our interests may sometimes lead us to tilt one way. It may sometimes lead us to tilt another way. It may sometimes lead us to upset both major powers to some degree. But as long as it is our interest and we can justify it in terms of a principled defense of our interests, I think we will need to have the courage to navigate these complexities in our own interests. After all, no country is put on earth. Singapore is certainly not put on earth, neither is the UAE, to bring joy to American hearts or joy to Chinese hearts. We are put on earth to bring joy to our own people's hearts. And if we bear that in mind and are not intimidated by the complexities, I think we can navigate it. As I said, it is not essentially a new situation. A divided international order is the more normal situation. My last point, and I'll be happy to take your questions, is that there is always agency. There's always some degree of agency. In fact, in the very complexity of the situation, creates agency. It may not always be a lot of agency, but the choices are very seldom going to be only binary. It's not only A or B. If we have the agility of mind, we can try to create possibilities. And of course, having created the possibilities, we will have to have the courage to take advantage of them. In other words, fatalism, a sense of fatalism, is fatal to small countries. And with that note, I will end, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, sir. We would like to thank the speaker for his informative take on U.S. relations, U.S.-China relations, in terms of the current challenges witnessed by smaller countries neighboring China, as well as possible opportunities for greater cooperation between the two to stimulate their respective economies and apply perhaps further impetus to the overall global economy. We would like to open the floor for a question and answer session now. I kindly ask that all people who wish to ask a question or comment keep them brief to allow for other participants to participate. لمن يريد أن يطرح سؤال أو مداخلة تكون مختصرة حتى تتاح الفرصة لأكبر عدد ممكن. شكرا. تفضل دكتور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. My name is Dr. Ali Al-Amoudi. I was a former United Nations advisor for sustainable development. I would like to welcome you here in UAE as well as in the ECSSR. I have a very small questions, two questions. The first one, the relationship between US and China, it goes like a wave up, down, like, you are in the ocean and there are some winds coming and it goes up and down. We are scared that this action might lead to a tsunami that will affect the whole world. How can you read this relationship? It's based on economic, sometimes failure, sometimes success, some political issues between US and China. The second one is the implications, as you mentioned in your in the title, the implication on the small states or the developing countries, as we read it from the United Nations, interventions, that it has a always political impact and economical impact. How do you see this impact on the small states goes? Thank you very much.
Okay, I agree with you that there are going to be always ups and downs in the US-China relationship. However, I think something fundamental has changed. As I said in my opening remarks, From 72 to around 2009, the overall balance was on engagement between the US and China. They tried to engage itself. So there were ups and downs, but it's within the overall framework of engagement. Now I think the balance has tipped. The overall framework is going to be of strategic competition. There will still be periods of engagement when the interests coincide, but the overall balance is on competition. And this obviously is going to have an impact on all of us and on the world economy. It's already having an impact, right? The world economy is in a rather fragile state. Chinese growth has slowed. The last American employment figures were not great. Europe is, German growth has certainly slowed. Europe is entangled in contradictions of its own making. Where is the growth? Japan is spluttering around. ASEAN is spluttering along, the Southeast Asian, but there is no big driver of growth. How do small states navigate? Well, I told you, I think we'll just have to look to our own interests. Sometimes we will have to maybe tilt towards China, sometimes we'll have to tilt towards the US, but basically we follow our interests, even if it means upsetting both to some degree. I mean, I can't speak for the UAE, but Singapore has been there before. We have sometimes had to draw red lines for the US. Sometimes we have to draw red lines for the Chinese. And sometimes we just have to upset both and follow our own interests. The difference is this. When, at least in our case, when we had to follow our own interests, which did not coincide with either's, it was episodic. Now I think it may be a long-term thing, which is going to take much more political courage and political cohesion internally to navigate. But I don't think it's impossible. As I said in my last remark, a sense of fatalism is fatal to small countries. There is always some agency, something you can do, if only you have the brain to recognize it and the courage to do it.
Does anybody else have any questions? Behind that. This gentleman here, please.
My name is Salman Kaikai from the Embassy of Sierra Leone. I was in Beijing in 2008 for a diplomatic cause, and I realized that many Americans were going to Beijing to study the Japanese language.
Chinese language.
I mean, to study the Chinese language. And I asked them, why are you going to China to study Chinese language? And one told me that in 10 years' time, if you don't learn Chinese, you will not eat. My observation is that a lot of people are doing business with China because China has a market now, not only for America, also for Africa and beyond. So what is your observation?
Well, my observation, that's correct. I mean, I think if you don't learn Chinese, you're not going to eat. That's obviously an exaggeration, you know, right? But China is a geopolitical fact that cannot be denied. China has problems, however, that should not be denied either. It has serious problems. In fact, it faces, as I was trying to explain, a very fundamental challenge, which they haven't figured out. I'm not saying they're going to fail, you know. They are a very adaptable country, but it is a challenge. But it is also a geopolitical fact. Now, I don't think the world is binary. The Cold War ended with an apparent victory for one side. I don't think this prolonged period of US-China strategic competition is going to end so neatly. In fact, there may be no clear denouement. Why not learn Chinese? I mean, why not? There's no reason not to, right? But I don't think the world is, an American order is not going to be neatly replaced by a Chinese order. It's not going to be so neat. What we are seeing, at least on the regional level, is an emerging multipolarity. I think my own region, what is now called the Indo-Pacific, is a naturally multipolar world. I do not see America disappearing from the Indo-Pacific. Of course, China will be there, and China will be always a significant influence, both economic, political, strategic. But America is not going to disappear. Japan is not going to disappear. India is not going to disappear. Korea's north and south are not going to disappear. Indonesia is a big country, you know, don't forget it, right? It's not going to disappear. Vietnam is another big country, 90 million people and growing. It's not going to disappear. Our region is a naturally multipolar region. I venture to suggest that the Middle East is also another naturally multipolar region. And therefore, in the multipolarity, there is maneuver space for small countries. Personally, I think it would be a disaster if there's only one world order, whether it's American or Chinese or European. At that period when it appeared that there was only one order, an American-led order, I mean, we face all kinds of problems, you know, even though America is a friend. And we will face problems if there's only a Chinese order. In multipolarity that is emerging, there is maneuver room, there is agency. Now, I don't know much about Africa, but I would suspect Africa is a vast place, right? You have Nigeria, you have Egypt, you have many countries. They're not going to disappear. I cannot, for example, conceive, no matter how important an economic partner China becomes, of any African country having fought so hard and so long for independence and autonomy, meekly subordinating yourself to any major power. So there is agency. I keep reminding people, including my own countrymen, that trade is not a favor one country does to another, you know. People trade with you because you have something that they want from you. And because and you can provide something, you can provide some good, some resource, some service in a more competitive way than other sources. And as long as you are more competitive, people will trade with you. It's not a favor. China is not trading with Singapore as a favor to Singapore. China is not trading with the UAE as a favor to the UAE. They are trading because it is to our mutual benefit. If there is no benefit to China, they won't trade with us. Simple as that. If there is benefit, they will continue trading. So you always have agency. One should not give up. One should not be sort of paralyzed by the complexities we face.
The gentleman at the back, please.
Ambassador Kausikan, my name is Habib.
I'm not an ambassador anymore. My official title is pensioner.
Pensioner, sorry sir. My name is Habibullah Haq from Zayed University, and I'm a Singaporean working here as an expatriate. Let me engage you. You said that what is going on now, the competition between China and US, is not unprecedented. And then you quickly compared that with the Cold War, basically.
I did not. I said the Cold War comparison is a superficial and intellectually sloppy one.
True.
It's more complicated
but you
than
mentioned that this is not unprecedented. I would argue that this is quite unprecedented. There's no parallel, because what is going on is a paradox. I mean, just last few years, US is withdrawing from the path of globalization. And the most unlikely candidate, China, has now become a major protagonist for globalization. So this is a new situation. There's a new twist in this. To say that we need to pursue our own interest is too broad a statement. I think we need to be nuanced a little bit to say, how do we identify our interest? Along what line? Along globalization or withdrawal and nationalism or some kind of narrow regionalism? So there are all kinds of variations that we need to explore. So to say that we should just pursue our interest is too broad a statement, I'm afraid.
Well, yes, of course, because I'm talking in general terms here. Each country will have its own definition of interest, and the definition of interest will change over time in specific terms. That is obvious. It's like saying water is wet. But I deny your premise that the US is withdrawing from the world. The US is taking a more transactional attitude towards the world. It is reverting to an older conception, a narrower conception of its national interest. Nothing Mr. Trump has done is unique, you know. Nothing Mr. Trump has done is as disruptive of international order as the 2003 invasion of Iraq by George W. Bush, at least in my opinion. Unilateralism, a preference for bilateralism over multilateralism, a preference for persuasion by coercion, shall we put it that way, these are not inventions of Mr. Trump. They have always been part of American foreign policy. They are now given more emphasis. And to me, that is quite normal because, look, I don't want to exaggerate the point, but I think Mr. Trump and Mr. Obama are more alike than either would care to admit. And in some ways, Mr. Trump is far superior to Mr. Obama, at least in his goals. You can argue about his methods. I would argue about his methods. But the goals he has set are not wrong in some cases. And I don't think the US is withdrawing from the world. As I said, how can you call robust strategic competition withdrawal from the world? He is not a great fan of a multilateral trading system, for example. He's not a great fan, or he has a certain clear preference for bilateralism over multilateralism, but these are not his inventions. That streak has always been in American foreign policy. Once upon a time, there was an American president who, with a stroke of a pen overnight, destroyed a world order, an international order that America had created. The name of that president is Richard Nixon, not Donald Trump. When he unilaterally took the US dollar off the gold peg in 1971, the year the UAE achieved independence, and destroyed the Bretton Woods system. Now, so I don't think the US is withdrawing from the world. It's not so easy to destroy an order, you know. All right? US is taking a different attitude towards their order. And why is Mr. Xi Jinping a great upholder of globalization? Why? Because China's growth rests on that foundation of an American-led order, which America is no longer as enthusiastic about. China was the main beneficiary of that order between 1991 and 2009, and it may well be the main loser if that order should further crumble. That is why he is such an enthusiastic upholder of that order. Even the Belt and Road, can the Belt and Road succeed if the world turns protectionist? I don't think so. So China is in the same position as the rest of us in this sense, maybe more so. Your point about interest, yes, that's a fair point because I'm talking in general terms. Obviously, the UAE's definition of interest will not be exactly the same as Singapore's definition, except in broad terms. Obviously, there's going to be a place for regional organization, there's going to be a place for international organization, there's going to be a place just for bilateral relationships, but every country will have to define that for itself. There is no magic formula.
Sir, yes, please.
Okay, my name is TJ, from a professor from Halifa University. So I speak from my own background, okay? I'm a Chinese citizen, but I'm also a US permanent resident. More importantly, I work for UAE, for people here, okay? So I think as a scholar, I firmly believe, I think a small-sized country like UAE can make significant contribution to global civilization. Any big-sized country which cannot make a significant contribution to the world does not deserve any reputation, okay? So for me, I think UAE still can have, like Singapore and UAE can have bright future because we have so many global citizens like me on the planet. We don't care, okay? So we work for the people like UAE. They treat us very professionally and give us respect. So that's from my heart, okay? Thank you very much.
Well, I don't disagree with you because I come from a small country. If I didn't think we could make a contribution to the world, I mean, then the only alternative is immigration or suicide, you know? So I agree with you.
Thank you. Anybody else has a question? Yes, sir, please. تفضلي.
Hello, Mr. Chairman. So I'm Humaid Azabi from Zayed University. And my question for you is that it seems that a recurring theme in this talk is about countries follow their best interests. And so I want to ask you, is it in China's best interest to wait out until the 2020 American election for a more preferential candidate, such as Joe Biden, Andrew Yang, or Bernie Sanders to strike a new trade deal with the US? Thank you.
Well, I don't think, okay, my own personal assessment is at this point of time, the 2020 election is still Mr. Trump's to lose, despite the poor polling numbers and so on, unless there is a complete collapse of the American economy, a big recession, right? If you look at the Democratic candidates, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are too far to the left to be I think, broadly appealing. Joe Biden is a very decent man. He's probably kind to children, kind to animals, and so on. But he's like yesterday's man. I don't see him as having a very broad appeal. Now, some American friends tell me there's a new phenomenon, that, anybody but Trump phenomenon, right? Maybe so, but we'll see. If Americans are so fed up with the political leadership, they might just stay home come voting day. But we'll see. But in any case, I think that's not relevant because, as I said, I think there is a new consensus across the American political body politic, across many issue domains, on a tougher approach to China. A new president, whether or not he's Mr. Trump, let's say he's not Mr. Trump, right? Whoever, right? Mr. X or Miss X, may differ in the methods, but it will be a change of degree, not change of goals. All right? So I think China would not be well advised to just wait because it may not get better. I used to think that there was a self-correcting mechanism in US-China relations because it was such a complex bundle of issues covering so many domains that the effort to reconcile American interests between one issue domain and the other inevitably brought the policy to the center. And that was so whether you started from the premise of greater emphasis on promotion on democracy and human rights like the Clinton administration did, or if you start from the premise of China as a strategic competitor, which the term was not invented by Mr. Trump either. The term was invented by George W. Bush, Bush 43. Whether you start from the right or the left, the effort to balance so many issues brought you to the center. I don't think so anymore, because there is a consensus across all issue domains on a tougher approach to China. The only debate I can see in the US is over a debate over means, not over the ends, right? Now, the most significant change, I think, is one that the Chinese leadership missed completely, is the change of in attitude of American business. That began to sour at the time of Bush 43, George W. Bush. But they missed it completely. I'll tell you a story. In March 2017, I happened to be in New York. And I was there just a few days after Vice Premier Liu He, who is responsible for negotiating this trade agreement with the US, had just arrived about 3 or 4 days before me. And when I was in New York, I went to see a friend of mine who is the CEO of a major American corporation, an important member of the US-China Business Council. And the US-China Business Council and American business in general had historically played a stabilizing role in the US-China relationship. So I went to see him, and he and his colleagues in the Business Council had just seen Liu He a few days before. So I asked him, what do you tell him? And his reply a little bit surprised me, because he said, we told Liu He that it is not just Mr. Trump, it is all of us. We have the same grievances. And I was a bit surprised because I said, surely he knew that already. He's supposed to be the expert on economic relations with US. He said, well, my friend replied, said he didn't seem to know it. So that was a major miscalculation and misjudgment on the part of China. Now, if they think they can wait out Mr. Trump, I think there will be another miscalculation and misjudgment. Because Mr. Trump is a symptom, he's not the cause.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Yes, the lady at the back.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Once an excellency, always one.
No, I'm not excellent at all.
Okay.
Ask my wife, she tells me I'm not excellent.
Okay. My name is Ade Garrick. I'm co-convener of the Global Ethical Finance Initiative Scotland.
Scotland?
Yes.
Wow, okay.
Thank you. It's an initiative,
Yeah.
a global one.
Yeah.
And my question is hinged on the quote of that great man of Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte, when he said some years ago, many years ago, let China sleep. When it will awake, it will shake the world. China, asleep or awake, continues to shake the world. My take is, and I would like to also find out what you believe on this, what would the smaller states, how would they react? Or how would they flow along or navigate? Timid or courageous? Is there going to be any winning point for the smaller states?
Well, China,
Thank you.
asleep or awake is a geopolitical fact, right? You can't wish it away. You will have to deal with it one way or the other. But my basic point, which is drawn from my own experience and the experience of my country, is small states always have some agency. Sometimes not a lot, but it's not that you have zero agency. You can always do something, right? So I think the most important thing for small states is not to be paralyzed by complexity, because complexity is also opportunity. So I think it's going to be more difficult, that's true. It's going to be much more difficult for all of us. In fact, not just for small states. For larger countries, it's also going to be difficult, right? But it's not as if, all is lost, there's no choice. There's always a choice.
I think we'll take a last question from the audience. This gentleman here in the middle. Thank you.
Oh, there's one more, two.
Thank you very much, Your Excellent Pensioner Goodness, sir. A shout out to my colleague from Sierra Leone. 我就是你刚才提到的那种从美国来的留学生. I am an American who did study in China and now work at the U.S. Embassy. So there you go. Small world. I did have a question for you. I'd love to get your thoughts. One of the concerns on the U.S. part is that China could use greater economic engagement with countries around the world as a stepping stone to other kinds of engagement that might be of greater concern to us. There are actual articles that have come out from the Global Times, for example, that explicitly mention China can no longer ignore the pleas of its SOEs abroad that are asking and clamoring for protection. And Xi Jinping himself has put out statements even last year during the China-Arab Forum that China wants to become the new guarantor of stability and security within the region, within the Middle East. So I'd love your thoughts as to where you think that kind of a narrative is true, or whether you think that that's kind of an overblown concern on the part of people who do worry about that. Thank you.
That's a very good question to which I don't have a straightforward answer, so I have to answer you in different slices, right? Up to this point, notwithstanding those statements by Xi Jinping and there are other Chinese leaders too, China has tried to keep its engagement of the Middle East almost purely economic. I mean, there have been some weapon sales and so on. And I can't blame them, This is like one of the most complicated and difficult regions of the world, right? But there has been no major power that has been able to do that. In other words, keep its engagement of the Middle East purely economic. They always get sucked into the geopolitical complexities, whether they like it or not. And I see that happening if you look at the Middle East in its broader context. PLA has been deployed in Tajikistan. People's Armed Police has been deployed with permission of Afghan government in Afghanistan. China has learned from America and have all kinds of private security companies running around, right? And I think in the long run, there will be a larger geopolitical role for China. Because as the American dependence on Middle East energy has come down, Chinese is still high. And right now, the Chinese essentially depend on the 5th and 7th Fleet to protect their energy routes, right? Which is an intolerable and unnatural situation for any major power, right? So I think they will try to have their own capabilities, but I think they are still quite some way away. It's not a matter of wanting to or not wanting to, they just do not have the capability to have the kind of sustained presence like the 5th Fleet has and the 7th Fleet has, right? But they will get there eventually. I mean, one day. When is that day? It's anybody's guess. I don't know. And I don't think there's anything particularly sinister about that. Now, the question of economic influence leading to political influence. At one level, of course, it's kind of like obvious, right? But if I look across the world at the instances where China has tried to deploy economic clout for political ends, I don't see very great successes, 2010, they banned rare earth exports to Japan, if you remember. What happened? Within a year, new sources of rare earths grew up, because rare earths are not that rare, right? They tried the economic weapon on the Philippines. It did not stop the Philippines from taking the case to the tribunal on the South China Sea. They deployed intense economic pressure on South Korea over the deployment of THAAD. THAAD was deployed. So I don't see it as a very useful tool. But economic influence, the general point is certainly valid. It's valid for the United States, it's valid for China, it's valid for everybody. Economic influence does lead to some degree of political influence, but the correlation is not so clear-cut. That said, I don't believe, for example, that the debt trap is a deliberate tool of Chinese foreign policy. If you look at the countries that have fallen into the so-called debt trap, they have one thing in common. They are all irredeemably corrupt. I've been traveling a lot in Central Asia since I retired, and I often get this question: how can we benefit from Chinese investment without falling into one trap or the other? My answer is always very simple: don't be corrupt. If you're not corrupt, negotiate properly, you need not fall into a debt trap. Why should you? Right? You are a sovereign country, after all, however small. And as I said, people are not trading with you, people are not investing in you as a favor, It's because they have some benefit. I take Singapore's own experience. It's not quite the same experience. When we became unexpectedly independent in the mid-1960s, we faced a serious economic crisis. Unemployment was in double digits, something like 14-15%. The British military presence in Singapore was a major part of the economy, and they already announced they are leaving. Our neighbors were not particularly friendly and were trying to shut us out of their markets. And the prevalent economic doctrine of those times was that multinational corporations were the enemy of the third world, because multinational corporations were much more powerful than most third world countries in terms of finance and other things. And if you let them in, they will take over your country. So the orthodox conventional wisdom was keep them out. Try to keep them out, keep them at arm's length. But we invited them in because we started from the premise, we are a sovereign country, we have our own laws. If we enforce our laws without corruption, we can deal with the multinational, we can benefit from them. And we did. I think if you look at Chinese overseas investment, there's no reason why anybody should shun Chinese overseas investment. Many countries need it. And the Chinese are willing to invest in countries that many more commercially oriented bodies may not find it attractive, right? But you have to exercise your sovereignty in a transparent and clean way. Then you will not fall into any trap. Then nobody can really coerce you, you know. Why should you allow yourself to be coerced? America is still a very major economic presence in Southeast Asia. In fact, the stock of American investment is much larger than the Chinese investment still. And if you take America and Japanese, many times larger. But America has not always been able to enforce its will on any of these countries, including my own, sorry to say, that if it's not in our interest. So I don't think the correlation is so simple. Where countries have fallen into traps is because those countries have been corrupt.
As we come to a close, I would like to thank Bilahari Kausikan for his speech and for being very, very welcoming to the answers and questions and his candor and being forthright. Certainly, on behalf of His Excellency Professor Jamal Sarid Al-Suwaidi, we would like to once again thank Bilahari Kausikan for his lecture, as well as the members of our audience for their participation. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank all of you for listening to me so patiently and not throwing things.